1. The tethered three. The Nile had retreated once more, as it had since time immemorial. It had risen like breath held in suspense, swallowed half the world, then slowly exhaled, leaving behind a tapestry of dark, fecund silt and confusion. Boundaries vanished as surely as if the gods themselves had wiped their divine slate clean. 3 men walked barefoot along a path that yesterday had been submerged beneath the waters. Their ropes were thick and coarse, woven from twisted flax, knots meticulously tied at precise intervals, hardened by relentless sun and countless seasons of sweat. These were their only instruments. These and the mathematics etched into their memories. Nebhotep, the eldest, walked with the slight stoop of one whose spine had been shaped by the river itself, curved over decades of tracing invisible lines in fertile earth. He spoke only when silence grew too heavy to bear. 72 floods had passed before his eyes, 56 times had his hands remeasured the reborn world. His fingers resembled ancient tree roots, each one bearing witness to innumerable knots tied and untied across a lifetime of measurement. Beku, in his middle years, moved with sinewy purpose, bare-chested beneath the Egyptian sun, his vigilant eyes constantly scanning the terrain. He walked in straight lines even when the landscape undulated beneath his feet. At 53 floods, he had witnessed enough of existence to understand its harsh necessities, but not so much that the fire of purpose had abandoned him. He comprehended intimately the value of a properly measured field. It represented the difference between equitable taxation and starvation for the families whose lives depended upon it. Ipuwer, merely 16, spoke with the boundless energy of youth, as though he possessed 30 lifetimes to spend. He gestured grandly with his hands, and occasionally stumbled over his own rope, or thoughts. This marked only his 3rd season of measuring. His father, a respected scribe, had filled the boy's imagination with stories of numbers and their mysteries, before fever had carried him to the afterlife. 2. Triangulating sand. They worked to redraw the boundaries of a minor priest's estate, whose barley fields had been swallowed by the flood, and deposited half a stadia northward. Land disputes would inevitably follow, they always did after the waters receded. But the priest compensated them well. Ipuwer pulled the rope taut between 2 stake holes. "Have you ever considered," he said, squinting as he assessed the angle, "how there's a certain beauty to this? That with nothing more than knots and tension, we create order from." He swept his arm toward the muddy chaos surrounding him. "From all this?" Beku crouched nearby, examining a shadowy furrow in the earth. "It's mud, Ipu. And you're standing in what smells distinctly like fermented donkey piss. That doesn't diminish the elegance of the idea. Doesn't improve your aroma, either." Ipuwer smiled, undeterred. "But truly, rope, tension, triangles. 3 knots. A triangle with a perfect square corner. Every single time. The mathematics reveals itself through our hands." Nebhotep lifted his head slightly at this, as though he'd glimpsed something in the distance that eluded the others. But he remained silent. "Look here," Ipuwer continued enthusiastically. He traced a figure in the wet silt with his toe. 3 knots by 4 knots by 5 knots. And the corner? He stooped to verify its squareness with a practiced eye. "Flawless. As though Thoth himself drew it with his divine ibis beak." Beku spat into the mud. "Thoth undoubtedly has more pressing matters than helping you sketch angles in the silt, boy." "How can you be certain?" Ipuwer challenged. "Perhaps this is precisely what gods do, create perfect shapes for mortals to discover." "Gods create chaos," Beku said, gesturing toward the retreating floodwaters. "We create order. That's our purpose." 3. Of gods and geometers. Later, when the sun had mellowed to a burnished bronze disk, and their shadows stretched longer than their patience, they sought respite beneath a gnarled thorn fig tree. The day's labor had yielded 16 new boundary markers, and 3 heated disputes with local farmers about where precisely their lands terminated. Ipuwer chewed thoughtfully on a date pit before declaring, "I believe the gods bestowed mathematics upon us." Beku rolled his eyes skyward. "Here we go again." "No, consider it genuinely. The square triangle, we didn't invent it. We discovered it. The gods embedded it here, waiting like a treasure buried in the Nile's depths." Beku spat dismissively. "Have you ever encountered a god?" "No." "Ever witnessed one hand someone a rope with 12 knots, while instructing them to go forth and triangulate? Perhaps they work through our hands and minds. Perhaps your skull contains nothing but ibis droppings." Nebhotep remained silent, absorbed in tracing abstract shapes in the dust with a broken reed. Ipuwer turned toward him. "What wisdom do you hold, old one? Are we divine vessels, or merely clever beasts?" The silence expanded between them like heat waves. Beku tore a substantial piece from his bread loaf, and stuffed it into his mouth. "Leave the old man be. He's earned his contemplative silence. But I yearn to understand his perspective." Ipuwer persisted. 5 decades of measuring. Surely he must harbor profound thoughts about what underlies it all. It means fields receive their proper boundaries, farmers know their limits, and tax collectors can perform their calculations. Beku said pragmatically. "It means we eat. That meaning suffices. There must be something deeper." Ipuwer insisted. "When I solve a complex problem, when I determine how to divide an irregular field, I experience, I cannot properly describe it, a connection to something greater. As though I'm touching the very mind of the gods. That's merely hunger making you lightheaded," Beku replied, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something more thoughtful. "I'm not dismissing the patterns entirely. They are satisfying. I'll grant you that much. But gods? You sound like those priests who extort farmers for half their harvest, to appease deities no mortal has witnessed." "The gods surround us continuously," Ipuwer insisted. "In the flood's eternal cycle, in the constellations above. In the tax registers?" Beku interrupted with a sardonic smile. "Because that's ultimately where our measurements end up. On some scribe's papyrus, determining precisely how much grain will be seized from which granary. 4. The divine indifference." That night, they rested near the weathered stones of a half-buried temple. Crickets wove intricate harmonies through the darkness. Stars pulsed overhead like forgotten fractions in an eternal calculation. Ipuwer lay sleepless, observing Nebhotep, who sat motionless, gazing at the night sky as though reading invisible hieroglyphs among the constellations. "Do you measure the stars as well?" Ipuwer asked softly. Nebhotep's gaze remained fixed on the celestial realm. "They measure us." Ipuwer sat upright, surprised by the old man's words. "Then you do believe the gods participate in our mathematics?" Nebhotep spoke at last, his voice textured like aged papyrus. "When I was but a boy," he said, "a woman told me that numbers were inscribed in the heavens. That the gods watched over humanity with divine measuring rods in hand." Ipuwer leaned forward attentively. "She claimed the Nile rose precisely according to divine will. That our ropes and stakes were merely instruments to interpret their celestial designs. And," Ipuwer prompted, "I spent the subsequent 60 years tying knots." He tapped his chest deliberately. "I witnessed no gods. I heard no divine whispers." He pointed toward the earth beneath them. "But this? The square triangle? Without fail. 12 knots. Rope drawn taut. It functions whether you offer prayers or not. It remains indifferent to who wears the double crown. The same in Nubia, in Thebes, even beyond the Great Sea. The child in the delta, The farmer in the hills, tie it correctly, and the corner manifests perfectly square. Always. He leaned back, his words complete. So I conclude, if gods exist, they are geometry itself. Coldly perfect. Utterly indifferent. And eternally present. Mathematics is not what deities bestowed upon us. It is how we fashion gods from observation. Beku grunted from his sleeping mat. That's the most I've heard you speak since we committed Panab to his tomb. Nebhotep acknowledged this with a single nod. And it marks the final words I shall utter tonight. But Ipuwer couldn't abandon the thread. If mathematics proves identical everywhere, doesn't that evidence something universal? Something divine in origin? Nebhotep's eyes reflected starlight. I've encountered traders from lands so distant their languages share not a single word with ours. Their skin, their garments, their deities, all foreign to our understanding. Yet they measure with ropes remarkably similar to ours. They construct identical triangles. Exactly my point, Ipuwer exclaimed. The gods communicate with all peoples through mathematical truth. Or perhaps, Nebhotep said deliberately, we all uncover the same principles because they simply exist, waiting to be found, like the stars themselves. No deity need position them each night. Then from where did they originate? From where did mathematics emerge if not from divine hands? The old man's face creased in what might have been the ghost of a smile. From where does the wind arise, boy? It simply is. And we simply discover its nature. Dawn fractured the horizon like a cracked vessel, spilling liquid gold across the eastern sky. Beku was already awake, coiling rope with practiced efficiency. Did you two philosophize through the entire night? He asked, without looking up from his methodical work. Ipuwer yawned expansively. Nebhotep suggests mathematics exists independently, like the wind itself. And you maintain it's a gift from Thoth or some other deity? Beku replied. Meanwhile, 12 more plots await our measurement before midday, and the overseer demands the complete tally by sunset. Nebhotep was already walking toward the first stake, rope in hand, his silence resumed like a comfortable garment. Truly, you harbor no curiosity about its origins? Ipuwer pressed Beku as they followed. The perfect relationships between numbers? The consistent behavior of angles? None of this provokes wonder in you? Beku halted abruptly. Let me share something meaningful. During the previous season, I measured a field incorrectly. My attention lapsed. The corner deviated from true. Do you comprehend the consequence? The family cultivating that land lost 1/10 of their plot to their neighbor's claim. 3 children endured hunger throughout that winter. He gestured emphatically at their measuring ropes. This work transcends gods or wind, or whatever metaphysical concept the old man contemplates. It concerns actual people. Living, breathing people. Our measurements matter because they directly affect lives, not because they connect to some abstract divine truth. Ipuwer opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, momentarily humbled by Beku's perspective. 6. Tensions and truths. The sun climbed higher as they labored. The priest arrived to oversee their work, stepping carefully to preserve his immaculate white kilt from the mud's touch, accompanied by 2 slaves bearing parasols. The boundary should extend to that sycamore, he proclaimed, indicating a distant tree with an authoritative gesture. Beku narrowed his eyes. The established markers clearly show it terminating at the irrigation channel, Holy One. Perhaps before the inundation, the priest replied smoothly. But surely the gods have blessed my estate with expansion this season. Nebhotep, without interrupting his careful work, slowly shook his head in silent contradiction. The rope reveals truth without bias, Beku stated firmly. Your field concludes here. The priest's expression darkened considerably. You dare contradict my authority? I who commune directly with the voice of Ammoniusare? We offer no contradiction, Ipuwer interjected diplomatically. We merely follow what mathematical principles dictate. The priest scoffed dismissively. Mathematics? A mere tool, nothing more profound. I interpret divine will with greater authority than some knotted cord. Nebhotep suddenly straightened from his work. His voice, when it emerged, carried quiet power like distant thunder over still water. Then alter it, he said simply. All eyes turned toward him. Change the mathematics, Nebhotep continued. If truly you speak with divine authority, command this triangle of 3 by 4 by 5 knots to produce a different corner. Make it submit to your will. A tense silence descended upon them. The priest's face flushed crimson with indignation. I shall report this insolence to proper authorities, he sputtered, before turning sharply and striding away, his attendants hurrying to maintain the parasols above his head. When the priest had retreated beyond earshot, Beku released a low whistle. That demonstration was either remarkably courageous, or profoundly foolish, old man. Nebhotep merely shrugged, and returned to his measurements. Ipuwer stared after the departing priest. He couldn't do it. He couldn't bend mathematics to his desire. No one can, Nebhotep said softly. Not priest, not pharaoh, not even the gods themselves. 7. The square truth. The following morning found them working with their ropes again, beneath the warming sun. Ipuwer worked quietly, contemplative, as he drew the knotted cord taut across another field boundary. Beku handed him the looped end of the measuring cord. Do you intend to worship it, or actually pull it tight? Ipuwer smiled wryly. I'll pull. But perhaps I'll whisper a hymn while doing so. They measured methodically. They positioned stakes with precision. The land took form like memory reconstructing itself after profound loss. As daylight advanced, Ipuwer found himself observing Nebhotep with increasing attention. The elder's movements possessed an economy and precision that approached ritual in their consistent execution. Something profound resided in his silence, in the way his gnarled hands caressed the measuring rope's knots with tenderness one might reserve for a beloved, or a child. I believe I comprehend your meaning now, Ipuwer announced suddenly, as they briefly rested in the shade of a solitary date palm. Understand what precisely? Beku inquired, wiping perspiration from his brow. What Nebhotep conveyed about mathematics embodying divinity itself. Beku sighed wearily. Are we revisiting that discussion? Listen carefully, Ipuwer insisted. Yesterday's confrontation with the priest, he couldn't alter mathematical truth. No mortal can. Mathematics establishes principles that even the most powerful must acknowledge and obey. Your point being? Perhaps that's the genuine essence of divinity. Not entities controlling worldly affairs, but immutable principles that even the mightiest beings cannot override. He glanced toward Nebhotep, seeking affirmation. Is that your intended meaning, elder? Nebhotep lifted his gaze briefly toward the empty azure expanse above. Nothing visible occupied that space. Yet the rope remained taut between his hands. The corner stood perfectly true. And somehow, that sufficed. Complete certainty forever eludes us, the old geometer said finally. Regarding gods, regarding mathematics' ultimate source. But we know with certainty that the rope functions reliably. We know the fields require accurate measurement. He ran a weathered thumb across a knot in his rope. After witnessing 72 floods, that practical knowledge satisfies me. Beku nodded slowly in rare agreement. For once, old man, our perspectives align. Ipuwer looked from one companion to the other, then contemplated his own rope thoughtfully. He traced the contours of a knot with his fingertip, feeling its rough texture, its undeniable physical reality. Perhaps you both speak truth, he reflected. Perhaps mathematics exists simultaneously as divine principle and human tool. A bridge spanning what we physically touch and what we can only conceptualize. Nebhotep's weathered face creased briefly in what might have been the suggestion of a smile. Continue pulling the rope, young one. Continue creating true corners. The answers will eventually reveal themselves, or perhaps they won't. They resumed their labor as the sun began its inevitable descent toward the western horizon. 3 men, 3 ropes, imposing order upon chaos, one precisely measured not at a time. In the distance, the eternal Nile flowed onward, indifferent to their philosophical discourse, carrying within its waters the promise of another inundation, another erasure, another opportunity to measure the world anew. 8. The geometry of memory. Months passed in rhythmic succession. Fields yielded their abundant harvests. The 3 geometers traveled from province to province, their reputation for unwavering accuracy and equitable judgment preceding them like ripples across still water. One evening, as they established camp near the ancient sacred stones of Abydos, a messenger arrived bearing unexpected news. The priest whose land they had measured had perished suddenly. Some whispered of divine retribution, others of poison administered through his wine. There, Beku remarked as they gathered around their modest fire. That's the consequence of challenging mathematical certainty. Ipuwer frowned thoughtfully. You believe the gods struck him down for his presumption? I suspect someone determined his measurements required permanent adjustment, Beku replied with dark implication. Nebhotep maintained his silence, though his fingers worked methodically at fashioning a fresh section of rope, creating precise knots with practiced skill. Later, after Beku had surrendered to sleep, Ipuwer moved closer to the elder geometer. I've been contemplating your words, he whispered, about mathematics sharing qualities with the divine. Nebhotep's hands continued their steady work upon the rope. What if, Ipuwer ventured cautiously, mathematics isn't something bestowed by gods, nor merely something existing independently? What if it represents something we've collectively created? Across diverse lands and throughout countless generations? The old man's hands paused momentarily in their labor. Consider this, Ipuwer continued with growing conviction. People everywhere have discovered identical patterns and relationships. Not because these truths waited passively for discovery, but because our minds somehow share fundamental similarities. Nebhotep's eyes reflected the dying firelight like distant stars. You propose the square triangle resides within our thoughts rather than within the physical world? I wonder if perhaps no meaningful distinction exists, Ipuwer suggested. Perhaps our thoughts and physical reality, perhaps they ultimately converge into a single truth. For the first time in Ipuwer's memory, Nebhotep laughed, a sound resembling dry papyrus crackling in flame. 16 floods, the old man remarked, shaking his head in wonderment. And already your thoughts penetrate deeper than most who've witnessed 60. Is that favorable? It's potentially dangerous, Nebhotep replied, though his eyes conveyed kindness. Reserve such speculations when in the presence of priests and officials. Ipuwer nodded solemnly, acknowledging the wisdom. But what is your assessment? Might my intuition contain truth? Nebhotep resumed his careful knot-making. I believe truth manifests like the Nile itself, following multiple channels, with certain pathways flowing stronger during different seasons. He raised the rope he'd been meticulously crafting. Here. I created this especially for you. Ipuwer accepted the gift, a perfectly proportioned measuring cord, exquisitely knotted, the intervals between knots precisely calibrated to uniform distances. My father's father presented me with my first measuring rope, Nebhotep revealed quietly. Now I extend this tradition to you. Employ it honorably. Ipuwer clutched the gift with reverence. I pledge to use it wisely. 9. The eternal measure. Years later, long after Nebhotep had joined his ancestors in the sacred field of reeds, Ipuwer and Beku stood together upon an elevated ridge overlooking the fertile valley. The annual inundation receded once again, leaving its benediction of black soil in its wake. Beku's hair now displayed prominent streaks of gray, and Ipuwer had matured into a man of 30 floods, respected throughout the region for his exceptional skill with the measuring rope. "Do you recall your youthful discussions about gods and mathematics?" Beku asked, a gentle teasing evident in his tone. Ipuwer smiled reflectively. "I was inexperienced then. And now?" Ipuwer contemplated the rope held reverently in his hands, the same one Nebhotep had bestowed upon him all those seasons past, carefully preserved, its knots maintaining their perfect truth. "Now I believe Nebhotep's wisdom proved correct," he acknowledged softly. "The ultimate origin of mathematics holds less significance than its practical application. What truly matters is that it functions reliably. That through it, we introduce some measure of justice and order into an otherwise chaotic world." Beku nodded with satisfied understanding. "The old man would approve of your perspective." They began their descent toward the waiting fields, where a new generation of anxious farmers anticipated the restoration of their boundary markers. Behind them followed a young apprentice, wide-eyed and brimming with questions about numerical mysteries and divine intentions. Ipuwer smiled as he recognized the familiar pattern of inquiry. The rope passed from hand to hand. The eternal questions persisted unchanged. The Nile would rise again inevitably. The land would temporarily vanish. And they would measure it anew, their ropes connecting them to all who had measured before and all who would follow in their footsteps. Within the infinite geometry of time, they represented mere points on an endless line. But in this present moment, they alone bore responsibility for ensuring the corners stood square and true. And somehow, that remained sufficient.